Welcome back to Detailed, an original podcast by RCAT. This is a show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guest today is Jeffrey Huber, FAIA, ASLA, NCARB, Lead AP, WEDG, is a principal at Brooks Scarpa, where he leads the firm's South Florida office. In addition to his practice, he is a professor at the School of Architecture at Florida Atlantic University. A distinguished architect and landscape architect, Huber specializes in public realm projects that seamlessly integrate ecological, landscape, urban, and architectural design. His research, teaching, and professional work have earned over 75 National Design Awards, including multiple honors from Progressive Architecture, the American Institute of Architects, the American Society of Landscape Architects, the American Architecture Awards, and the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. The project we're talking about today is the DC Alexander Park in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. DC Alexander Park reimagines what a resilient, community-centered beachfront landscape can be. Once a flat expanse of asphalt parking lot along Fort Lauderdale Beach, the 1.2-acre site has been transformed into a living model of ecological restoration and climate adaptation, employing a design called Botanized Asphalt, where infrastructure and play coexist seamlessly. Now, let's get into the details. Welcome back to Detailed. My guest today is Jeffrey Huber, FAIA, ASLA. There's a bunch of other letters I saw in another bio. Principal at Brooks Scarpa with offices in California and Florida. As a matter of fact, Angie Brooks and Larry Scarpa were previous guests on Detailed on another project. The project Jeff and I will be chatting about today is the DC Alexander Park, which I thought was in DC till I started doing my homework, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Jeff, welcome to Detailed. How are you today?
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me. I'm interested in talking about this project, but first I have to get to know you a little bit. Always start with an icebreaker question just to warm us up. So after reading your bio on the website, which I might add was much longer than the one you sent me, very humble what you sent me based on what I read on the website, I have concluded that you are a very busy man. Between your practice, you teach, you serve on multiple association boards, and you have won a massive, I was going to try to list some of them out until I saw how big the list of awards that you have won is. And I said, forget it, not going there. So tell me one interesting thing about yourself that I wouldn't find in your professional bio.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, one thing doesn't usually come up or make it into my professional bio is kind of how deeply, I guess, my own life experiences have shaped the way I practice today. Now, I grew up in a little town called Homestead. It was just south of Miami. And when I was young, my family home was destroyed by Hurricane Andrew. And so living through that experience left a huge mark. And it taught me firsthand kind of that storms aren't just weather events, they're life events, and that recovery can sometimes be even harder than the storm itself. And so that's really where my focus on resilience began and kind of my career in architecture. At the same time, I'm a twin. That's really another thing. I was attending a New World School of the Arts in Miami and studying in this very creative environment that was surrounded by visual arts and visual artists. And that exposure to art and storytelling also gave me a sense that design isn't just about problem solving. It's also about meaning, culture, and experience. And so that's really why later I think I spent, I guess another thing it's not there in my bio was I also spent what I like to call my exile in Arkansas, but I was in Arkansas for about a decade where I was the assistant director of the University of Arkansas Community Design Center. And there I dove into a lot of issues around stormwater management, urban agriculture, and what we called wicked problems. And that period gave me the kind of tools to merge the kind of professional lessons of Andrew and Hurricane Andrew with the research and practice that I'm involved in now. And so when I approach a project like DC Alexander Park that we're going to talk about, I bring all of that to this kind of lived shared experience of that disaster and this artistic sensibility and the academic and professional groundings and resilience that I've had. So, together those experiences have really shaped me as a designer I am today.
Well, I love that answer because I do think we learn from our, hopefully some of us learn from our life experiences, and when you can take those lessons into everything that you do, it is a game changer. It is, it does change the path. I do a lot of
Right.
things as well professionally that I'm really passionate about, just as a human, like mentoring. And I'm really grateful for the mentors I had when I was younger that sent me on my path, which was not going to have anything to do with this industry, by the way. And so I also learned before we started the podcast that you're also saving the turtles.
Yes. Yeah, that is another thing which, I got to see my first turtle hatching on Friday night, which was just a magical experience.
Oh God, those little baby turtles are so cute. Okay, so we're working our way towards this project, but first, okay, I read that you have a master's degree and are licensed both in architecture and landscape architecture. Not something you see every day.
Right.
So tell me, what made you? I mean, you may have just answered this question, but what made you do both?
Yeah, I think for me, it was never about choosing between architecture or landscape architecture. It was always about how they overlap. And so I think I was just talking about the growing up in South Florida and living through Hurricane Andrew. I mean, as I just mentioned, this destroyed my childhood home, and that experience really impressed or, gave me a sense of understanding how buildings and landscapes can't be separated. The way a community recovers isn't just about structures, it's about the environment around them and the community in general. So I pursued both degrees in licensure because I wanted to work across those boundaries. I see architecture and landscape as one continuous design problem. And so how we shape space for people, ecology, and resilience, it's essentially community or urban design. And so at Brooks Scarpa, this lets me kind of integrate ecological systems and urban design into buildings and vice versa. And so it's really about seeing the built and natural environments as inseparable, interconnected, and in constant acts of change. And that's what's really got me interested and kind of and drove me into becoming both an architect and a landscape architect.
And it's really interesting because in my career, that's not typically how I've seen our profession look at it. But I did another interview a while back, um, where the architects had the same attitude. Only this particular project was in wildfire country, and we talked a lot about how the choices they made on the site outside the home were directly related to the fact that it was in the middle of wildfire country. And that was the first time as I have a forest for a backyard, the first time I really thought
Right.
more about what's going on outside my home. And so I hope more people think about it that way after hearing this episode. So let's talk. We're actually going to talk about the project now. Let's start with a little history behind the DC Alexander Park. Who's the client and what was the need?
Yeah, the client for DC Alexander Park is the city of Fort Lauderdale, and so they came to us with essentially an underused parking lot on a narrow barrier island. Right across the street is the beach. To the east, it's the beach, and then to the west is actually the International Swimming Hall of Fame. And so the city had committed to a decade-long program of coastal resilience investments in this area. They are calling and branding the Loop. And so this was one of the sites that we had an opportunity to turn this asphalt into something much more. It was a public space that would absorb floodwaters, could provide shade, and reconnect people to both the beach and to the city. DC Alexander was actually one of the first pioneering developers on the beach, actually founding this area and bringing it urban development to the area. And so that's where the name of the park actually, or where it gets its name. So those were all kind of interesting tidbits, but it wasn't just about resilience in the technical sense that the city wanted us to look at. The site has many layers of that history from DC Alexander and beyond, from its days as a Las Olas casino pool to its role as a Seminole trading post. And then it also standing right in the middle of the current park, or when we first came to the park, is a Peter Wolf Tulf's Whispering Giant sculpture, which was placed there in 1983 as part of his Trail of Tears series. And so this is like a 30-foot tall cypress bust memorializing indigenous presence in this place. And so we felt it was important to honor and retain that sculpture, even if the park around it was now completely reimagined. And so the city's need for resilience and community space was one option, but for us, the design challenge was also broader. How do we create an environment that protects against sea level rise, storms, restores ecosystems, and in essence, rewilding the site, and at the same time acknowledges the cultural and historical significance of the site?
So it was an easy project then.
Yes. Yeah, it didn't have many things going on.
Yeah, not a lot going on there to deal with. So how did you or your firm, Brooks and Scarpa, end up involved in this project?
Yeah, we became involved because the city of Fort Lauderdale, again, was looking for a design partner that could merge, all these different things, but specifically the resilience, ecology, and public space into one cohesive project. And our firm was already or had already been working in that space. So both through BuiltWorks and through my own research like Salty Urbanism, which focuses on strategies for adapting to sea level rise and climate stressors. So when the city set out to reimagine DC Alexander Park, we were invited to bring that perspective, not just designing a park, but designing an urban landscape that acts as an infrastructure. Keith was the local landscape and civil engineering firm. And so they asked us to partner with them. And we brought along RGD as well as EES Design Studio, and later on, Shift Construction, who was the contractor, came on board. And so, as an entire team, we were really trying to postulate and kind of formulate the goals that were to create something that would protect the shoreline, restore habitat, provide passive play that feels joyful and civic. And so, in that way, it was a somewhat natural fit for our practice, because again, we were looking at how do we blur the lines between architecture, landscape, and urban design, and this project needed all three working together.
So before we start digging into specifics about the project, broadly describe the scope of this project.
Yeah, so at its core, the project transformed this essentially about 1.2 acres of beachfront asphalt. Again, it was a former parking lot into a resilient public park. So that meant completely rethinking the site as a layered infrastructure. And so we wanted to restore coastal dunes, looking at hammock ecosystems, creating shaded plazas, passive recreation spaces, an integrated playscape that also doubles as protective landscape. And the centerpiece was this ramping dune that also rises into a sculptural pavilion and a cantilevered overlook. It's both an iconic public art piece as well as a piece of resilience infrastructure. And so around that, we rebuilt the site with the native plantings that could absorb stormwater, mitigate flooding, creating habitat, while also designing a civic plaza that calms traffic and then reconnects to future development that's happening and currently occurring across the street. So the scope wasn't just about landscape beautification. It was about creating, again, a hybrid ecology, infrastructure, and public space, all within a relatively compact site.
So this project, I'm looking at this, and I just knew that I didn't know who the client was. Actually, I didn't know if it was like the building next door, or whoever owned that building or hotel or whatever that is. It looks like the kind of project that might potentially have more than one governmental agency involved. I've done a lot of public work in my career. What did the planning process look like for this project?
You're exactly right.
Smarter than I look.
This planning process was much more, was as much about coordination as it was about design. Because the site sits on a barrier island, we weren't just working with the city of Fort Lauderdale. We were working with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. We were working with the Florida Department of Transportation. We had to navigate multiple layers of agencies beyond even these: coastal regulators, Parks and Recreation Department, Public Works Department, and even the very specific things like the sea turtle lighting ordinances, which, we were talking earlier about this. And so, like, that, just quick side note, this was part of our urban beaches, and they're at the front line of protecting endangered sea turtles. And just to kind of touch on that turtle lighting here for a second, my wife and my oldest daughter currently volunteer with a group called Stop Sea Turtle Oversight Protection. And this organization monitors nests and rescues hatchlings, especially when they get disoriented from light pollution and overdevelopment. So just this past weekend, as I mentioned, I was volunteering with them and saw my first green turtle hatching, and it was a magical and, honestly, like I said, life-altering kind of, sight, but it reminded me of how fragile and interconnected these systems really are, and how meaningful something that we had to take on at DC Alexander as one of these kinda agencies involved, really is critical. And, has kind of allowed me to understand what we need to do as architects, as landscape architects, to really see and make sure, our ecosystems and these kind of endangered species can thrive, and why these regulations are in place in the first place. So in the parks planning, we really did have to align with a lot of resilience goals. So we had to do storm surge modeling. Floodplain requirements were also critical, which I'm sure we'll touch on some of that, but accessibility, habitat restoration, and the city's clear directive that this wasn't just only about protection. It had to be civic, it had to be beautiful and welcoming, and what they called an Instagram moment. That's what they wanted to see in the city. And so the process really became about weaving all of those voices, all of these requirements into one cohesive project. That's what our role was, taking on, again, this resilience, this infrastructure and ecology, and translating them into a public space that could perform technically, but also would bring joy to the community and to the residents, as well as to the visitors of the city of Fort Lauderdale.
Every time I think I'm not going to hear something new, I hear something new. Sea turtle lighting ordinances. I mean, I did not have that one on my bingo card, nor did I have that many agencies um, on my bingo card for this conversation. I figured there was probably two or three. Uh, how long did the planning process take?
Well, I always say, there's wicked problems and then there's wicked permitting. And that's really what this project had to go through. It was quite an extensive process because you had to set up from the state level, through even FEMA requirements for federal, but you're still going through state and local jurisdictions, like the county is the floodplain manager there. All of these things had to be put into place, and that was probably about a 9-month process before we could even submit to a permit at the city of Fort Lauderdale. And that was another lengthy process because, they're more concerned about, zoning, other controls, setback issues, but also about the Florida building code and those kind of ramifications that we had to think through. So life safety, fire, egress, all those kind of things that you are also challenged on top of these projects was really, had to be sussed out, really organized, and really kind of tangibly, kind of cataloged and planned throughout that process. But I would say, yeah, I mean, it's pretty standard these days for a project, especially in the public realm, to some cases take 9 to 12 months of permitting, to get through these, because of that multi-jurisdictional, multi-agency kind of faceted, aspect of them, the complexity of them too.
That's a lot of boxes to check. So, what did you? I'm always because I get some of the best stories here, but what did you have to work with on this site? Um, you know, I've heard all kinds of things having to dig feet down to remediate the site or things like that. I know it was a parking lot, but you know, there's more than just the asphalt sitting there. It's whatever's underneath it. So what did you have to deal with on this site before you could even really get going?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the site was about a 1.2 acre parking lot. So it's not that it was that big. It's relatively flat, hot, and highly vulnerable to flooding and storm surge. That's kind of what we took on ecologically. It was a dead zone. It was impermeable, had a lot of impervious surfaces. It's heat absorbing, so it created a lot of heat island, and it was cut off from the surrounding coastal systems and really the community in general. It was a kind of hostile site. As I mentioned before, it also it's located on the barrier island. It gave us an incredible proximity to the beaches, but also to the breezes that we could really take advantage of. But as I mentioned before too, the cultural landmark that already existed on the site with Whispering Giant sculpture. And that was all pretty important, but it was interesting as they started excavating. We did find the old casino foundations. So this was the saltwater pool that was on the site previously, but they also found an incredible amount of First People or Native American artifacts from the Tedesqua and other tribes that were here long before the Seminole or Miccosukee tribes that we see presently here today. And so it was interesting as the contractor was in there. We had an archaeologist on site looking and making sure that we didn't come across human remains, but we did come across a lot of artifacts, a lot of tools, especially conch shell tools, which was pretty spectacular and amazing. So, going back to like the fact that the asphalt was there and offered very little. There was a lot happening with the combination of the place, the history, and the cultural meaning that gave us this opportunity to completely rethink the site. And we were able to peel back some of that hardscape and rebuild it as a kind of living infrastructure for the next 50 to 100 years. And so this was something that could serve as both a model for climate adaptation, but also a place for cultural play and cultural respect.
So I didn't warn you. I sometimes go down rabbit holes, but I have to ask this question. I teach a class on project delivery, and I'm always talking about how important the geotech report is. You need to know what's under the ground because if you encounter things like
Yes.
burial sites or Native American, artifacts or some kind of artifacts, that can sometimes stop your project in its tracks.
Yes.
When you started digging and finding these things, did you run into that at all, or were you able to keep, or did you have to then employ some different methods for digging?
Well, when we wrote the specifications, there was a requirement to have an archaeologist because we knew how culturally sensitive this site was and the history that this site had. And so that presence of ensuring that an archaeologist was there whenever we were doing any excavation, especially for the foundations of the new park, um, and we were coming in and finding some of these artifacts, the archaeologists did come and they would make sure that there was no bone material present, human remains especially. There was a lot of oyster shells as well as these other kind of conch shell on there because, that was primarily a lot of the diet of, the Native Americans that were here first in there, and so we found a lot of that, but how they used those and employed those as tools, so it slowed the project down, but it didn't stop the project because really we just had to go ahead and make sure the archaeologists were there and would go ahead and, essentially take that material, catalog that material, and ensure that there was nothing else. So it was kind of haphazard, and keep in mind that site was already heavily impacted from these the pool that was built in the 1920s, all the way to the kind of developments that came through all the way to our time. So to find artifacts that were still there from predating that time was quite spectacular, and ironically could have even been brought in from another site just with fill and sand that was being brought in there. And so when you're saying the geotechnical reports, when we got them in here, I mean, the site is primarily sand, but it also has what's called muck. And muck was essentially a nice glorified word for dead mangroves. It was like the things that they basically would put soil on top of and allowed. And so when we got into some of the mangrove areas, that's where you'd see less of the Native American habitat or Native American settlements because it was obvious that was more the areas that flooded. And it's just ironic on a 1.2 acre area, but because we're on the barrier island, you had some extreme elevation changes. Like in some cases, just on this one site, we had about 12 foot of elevation change historically. If you went there today, because we denuded a lot of the landscape and brought in a lot of fill, it looks like a flat site. But historically speaking, it would have probably had about 12 feet of change, which is drastic when you talk about Florida, especially a county like Broward County, where, our highest elevation above sea level is 22 feet, and it's probably for less than 1% of the total land mass, where on average we're about 4 feet above sea level. So you can see that that kind of extreme elevation changes kind of creates, some unique challenges in this particular area to essentially a dynamic ecosystem because it is a barrier island.
Great lead into the next question. Like, did you prepare for that? What would you say that was the most challenging thing to tackle on this site before you could actually start doing any work? What was
Yeah, I think the most challenging thing for the site, was again kind of understanding the history, understand the cultural significance, but really, understanding what was historically there, especially as an ecosystem. And so I always like to, as an architect and as a landscape architect, start off thinking about the geology, the hydrology, and the ecology of the site. So we layered in, thinking about the barrier island ecosystems and beginning to delaminate it and understand the dunes versus the coastal strand versus the maritime hardwood hammocks, and even going back to mangrove forests and really understanding this dynamics of this ecosystem and how we would begin to design and plan and manage and think about those aspects when delivering this project.
so you used some terms in your project description that, because I don't work for landscape architects, I was not familiar with. So you're about to teach me a few things. So the first one is your project description said that this project botanizes. And I said it that way in case you're listening and not watching, you're not seeing my little quote fingers. This project botanizes the previous asphalt parking lot. So explain to me what exactly that means.
Yeah, so when we say the park botanizes the asphalt, we mean we're replacing a dead, impermeable surface with living infrastructure, with living landscape that performs multiple functions. Landscape can no longer be seen as decoration, it must be seen as infrastructural. And that's a cognitive leap for a lot of people when you're thinking about a plant in the same way as a pipe. But for us, it's almost essential and quintessential to think about it in that way. So the asphalt was essentially a heat island that was shedding water straight into the stormwater system and back to the ocean. If we're talking about water quality issues, we're also talking about extreme heat and other things. So by peeling back and peeling away and rebuilding the site with these dunes, these hammocks, the native coastal vegetation, we turn the ground itself back into infrastructure. And so plants like sea grapes, gumbo limbo, the buttonwoods don't just look good, but they also help to stabilize the soil, absorb stormwater, provide shade, and create habitat. And so botanizing is really about giving the site back to nature in a way that still supports people. And it's taking something lifeless and making it into a resilient ecological system that doubles as a civic park.
I'm never going to look at a project the same way again, and it's all your fault. So you also talked about vegetated, quote again, root dunes. That's not easy to say, root dunes. Another term that is new to me. So explain that one to me.
Yeah, so I mean, root dunes is very similar to sand dunes, but I don't like to call things sand dunes because it's not really the appropriate term. Sand dunes are what you'd find out in a desert, but root dunes is really what we have on the coast here, and it's sand dunes that have plants in them. So those roots are essentially an engineered landform that in the case of our project, we used the root dunes to essentially engineer a landform that was designed to mimic natural coastal dunes. And we shaped the mounds with sand and soil. We then stabilized them with native vegetation whose roots bind the earth together. And so when you think about what you see on top of the root or on top of the mounds or on top of these dunes, grasses can be as high as 2, 3 feet tall. Well, if you think about the flip side of that, that's what their root system is. It's about this doubling. So what you usually see on top is happening below the ground. And that can really stabilize. So these roots do a lot of real work. They look They lock the dunes in place first and foremost against erosion, absorbing stormwater, and then allowing the land to flex and recover after events like king tides we're just in right now, as well as any storm surges that happen from the coastline. And so over time, wind and sand also migrates and actually helps the dunes to grow stronger and builds them up. So it's a kind of self reinforcing system. Since the installation in October of last year, I mean, we've actually seen these dunes, these root dunes, have grown several inches higher. So they're actually working as intended. And on the site, the dunes, aren't just protection and vegetation. There's also these other rubberized dunes that we call them. And these are part of the playscape that kids can climb on, that they can slide on. So the landscape, again, functions both as infrastructure, but also as recreation. And so that's the beauty of it, resilience and joy in the same kind of gesture that these root dunes kind of provide.
I never thought about that. Obviously, I'm on the other coast, and I'm picturing our beach where we have tons of root dunes. But a sand dune is a sand dune, right? That's how I've always thought about it. But you're right; those don't go blow away when it gets windy, and change. And I never thought about the fact that those grasses and everything that you see are what's helping hold them there.
Yeah, we learned a lot of lessons even after like Hurricane Irma and a lot of these hurricanes that have come and actually shoved a lot of the sand from the beach over back onto A1A. And so this was one of the issues that we were really trying to solve for in the project. Was restoring this kind of dunescape that could help stabilize the soil and the sand in place.
So one more. I want all my definitions today. What is a hammock ecosystem?
Yeah, so a hammock ecosystem, at least for us here in South Florida, it's a maritime tropical hardwood hammock or a forest, if you will. And so these developed on slightly elevated ground in the kind of coastal South Florida context where I mostly practice. And so the word hammock here doesn't mean something that you swing in, it's referring to an ecological island of trees and vegetation surrounded by wetlands and lower ground. And so these ecosystems were incredibly important because they act like natural sponges. They help to absorb and filter rainwater, buffer against flooding, and provide critical habitat for native plants and wildlife. And so they also offer shade and cooling, which is essential in this kind of hot urban environment like Fort Lauderdale. So again, by reintroducing this kind of idea of the hammock and the edge around the park, we not only restored the parts of the area's ecological heritage, but also created shading, gathering places, and resilient infrastructure that helps the city adapt to rising seas, but also heavier storms. And we're seeing a lot more frequent of those in the last few years.
I can't. We don't have our big thing that we worry about here is earthquakes. We don't have, we hear we're going to have like 40 or 50 mile an hour winds and everybody freaks out. But I have, like everybody in the country, have watched storm after storm um, that have hit particularly Florida, but different parts of the East Coast, and it's heartbreaking. It is truly. I just watched a documentary just probably 2 weeks ago, a new documentary that's out on Hurricane Katrina and a lot of the things that went on during all of that. And it is just, it is devastation. And I don't know how you could not be thinking about that in anything you're doing. I know
Right.
I'm a spec writer. I type the Florida laws into my specs all the time. They're, in my list of reference standards because of the winds and the things that you have to deal with there. And I've always thought if I ever have to do a project in Florida, I'm going to have to learn a whole new language. It's because it's just like California and
Right.
Florida, probably the two hardest states in the country to do a project in
Right.
because of those requirements. So describe for me in detail some of in more detail. We've already did the broad scope. In more detail, some of the unique features of the work you designed for this site.
Yeah, so I would say one of the most striking features is the ramping dune that rises into this kind of sculptural pavilion and cantilevered overlook. And it's not just about an elevated platform, it is a biomorphic kind of form that blends landscape and architecture. It's also shielding the playground, playscape around it while still remaining open to the street. And so the overlook is also universally accessible, and it serves as a public art and fulfills the city's goal of creating this kind of iconic gathering spot. As I mentioned earlier, they wanted this kind of Instagram moment. Another unique aspect is how the landscape itself performs as infrastructure, as I've already been talking about. The root dunes and the hammock ecosystem act as a kind of natural flood control. They absorb stormwater, they buffer storm surge. Over time, they'll also continue to grow stronger as wind and sand migrate naturally across the site. And so I always say, landscape from this in this point, if we look at a pipe like you would look at beer has a shelf life, it has an age, it will get worse as it gets older, where this landscape, especially when you think about landscape as infrastructure, it's like wine, it gets better with age, it gets more resilient over time. And so, we really are considering how we also designed the coastal plaza on the park's edge that calms traffic, provides shaded gathering spaces. It's planted with native vegetation, native species like I mentioned before, sea grapes, gumbo limbo, and buttonwood. And even the play equipment and rubberized surfacing were integrated into that kind of resilient strategy that doubles as infrastructure while creating a kind of joyful space for children and families to play and gather. And so what makes this project unique is that every element, whether it's these kind of dune, a tree, a plaza, or a piece of sculpture, serves multiple roles: ecological, civic, and even experiential and experimental. And so that was, that was that it couldn't be value engineered out too. I think that's a critical aspect of this project. We were looking at, and all too often, many projects get under what we all refer to as value engineering, but sometimes I call it just what it really is, devalue engineering. And so, it's that point of looking at how do we design critical and functional, as well as long-term maintenance and operational, as well as economic value into the overall design, and so that every dollar that was spent in construction was going to save $7 in the long run due to integrative and resilient design techniques and strategies on the project.
I call it vulture engineering. It's probably going to get me in trouble one of these days. So let's talk a little bit more about the cantilevered overlook. So, a couple of things popping into my brain as you're telling me about this project is, what materials did you use? What is this built out of? And is, because it's pretty darn cool. But the first thing I thought of when I looked at that picture, knowing where this project was, once I figured out it wasn't in DC, um, what about wind? So what is it made of, and what did you structurally do with that so that when you have these storm events that you have regularly there, it's still hopefully standing?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, we have to actually design to 180 mile per hour sustained wind loads here, and much over 200 miles per hour for 3-second gusts, and so it really makes it difficult to build in Miami-Dade and Broward County. Broward County is where we're located here at Fort Lauderdale. Miami-Dade is obviously where Miami is, but these two counties, more so than any other area in the United States, have to deal with these phenomenal wind loads, and so you're asking about the overlook and the cantilevered overlook specifically. I mean, this was really the heart of the park. It's a 25-foot cantilevered platform that rises over this kind of ramping dune and projects dramatically towards the ocean. I often say it's going to be the best spot in Fort Lauderdale to watch the sunrise and the moonrise. um, we don't, unfortunately, since we're facing east, don't get to watch the sunset. That's something you definitely get from the Pacific Ocean. But here, there's something else more unique and special, I think, when you're on the Atlantic, especially on this East Coast side of Florida. And so structurally, it's a very muscular concrete structure and steel frame, even in that structure, but also above. And we wrapped that steel frame structure above in this kind of perforated metal skin. And that this essentially kind of glows both dawn and dusk. We wanted to give it a kind of lighting, a kind of ethereal quality to this. But to mention and talk about the concrete work, I mean, this we learned a lot of lessons from Surfside and the Champlain South Tower collapse in Surfside a few years back, where 99 people lost their lives, unfortunately, and that was due to over um, overexposure and corrosion in the context of a building that was just over 40 years old, but it was this constant, the saltwater spray on it, but also the saltwater kind of encroachment into the water table, all of these kind of excessive challenges. And so when we designed this concrete structure for DC Alexander Park, we wanted to ensure we did some lessons learned there. And so we actually integrated galvanized steel reinforcement. It's far stronger concrete than it had to be, but we also integrated um, a a waterproofing agent into the concrete that essentially makes it impregnable to water, whether it be salt water or fresh water. And so this really created a combination to heavily protect this structure from that constant bombardment that was going to get in the context. And so we also I wanted to also see that this thing functionally it worked at multiple levels. It's universally accessible, this overlook. So anyone, whether they're on foot or in a wheelchair or with a stroller, can spiral up the dune and really enjoy these panoramic views of the beach and horizon. It also provides shade and shelter to the playground beneath. And so it doubles as this kind of elevated gathering space and a protective canopy or community porch at the bottom. We also partnered with Eric Small. He's an engineer and an artist, and his team at EES Design Studio here in Fort Lauderdale. They were critical partners in making the overlook possible. So Eric is both, like I said, an engineer and an artist, and his fabrication expertise ensured that the perforated skin, the structural system, weren't just beautiful but also durable enough to withstand the constant salt air, hurricanes, and extreme coastal conditions. Their craftsmanship really gave the overlook the longevity it needs to thrive in this environment. And so I remember when we first brought him our design proposal, and he was just like, "You want me to build this right where it's going to be on 180 miles?" Like, Jeff, are you kind of crazy? Is Brooks Scarpa like, we need to check on you, but it was an amazing partnership because he was able to kind of look and talk and he does and builds a lot of Alice Haycock sculptures in New York and around the globe, quite frankly. And so he had this expertise of projects that public art that he's built in Abu Dhabi, other public art that he's done along coastlines, and was able to bring that to bear for us. And so the city also wanted to see this overlook again, as I mentioned, this kind of Instagram moment of creating this kind of iconic civic landmark, as they called it. So for us, it was equally important that it functioned as resilience infrastructure with this kind of dune, the pavilion working together to buffer wind, storm surge, and sun exposure. And so the overlook really did embody the kind of ethos of the project, where we're merging infrastructure and sculpture into a single gesture that's protective, inspiring, and as we hope, unforgettable.
Well, it's beautiful. We've been talking about this. Storm surges are a big deal. And when so I understand now what you've done with this overlook to make it resilient, but because of a project I worked on a number of years ago, it keeps popping in my head, the high water table, the storms, it's the beaches. I looked at the pictures. The beach is right across the street. There has to be a high water table. So it would seem to me that a structure like that, you don't only have to protect above ground because it's high water table, sand. Sand moves. I know I had a very not pleasant experience as a teenager, sand in a log and me being pinned underneath it. With moving sand actually is what saved my life. But tell me about this. How high is the water table? I mean, the beach is right across the street. It's got to be right there. And how do you
Right.
secure a structure, a big, heavy structure like that, so the wind doesn't just pull it right out of the ground?
Right. Well, there's a lot of piles that basically create friction piles that are 40-foot deep that are holding this whole thing up, and create a kind of bearing pressure. But you're absolutely right. Being right there on the barrier island, the site doesn't really have a conventional water table, but it does sit over what we call a freshwater lens. And so essentially, this is where the salt water is actually goes completely underneath the island and pushes up this fresh water through capillary action. So all the rainwater essentially is what's collected there and creates this freshwater lens. And so you hit this saturated soil at just a few feet down, and in some cases, depending on where you are, it could be an inch down. And that meant every time we excavated, the pits filled with water almost immediately, and so we had to really challenge ourselves and try to work during the dry season where the water table was much lower. And try to avoid any kind of the dewatering. So for something like the cantilever overlook, we really needed to have a massive foundation, and that was a huge challenge. Like I mentioned, there's 40-foot friction piles at about 3 foot on center all through this, holding this up. And so there's a lot of infrastructure you just don't see above the ground that's below it. And so, in fact, when viewers and they may get a kick out of this, the concrete that supports the chin of the column was called out to be 12,000 psi concrete. So it's quite strong. I mean, conventionally speaking, most concrete's about 2,500 pounds per square inch is given the typical, and this was 12,000. So it was about 10 times what we would typically see, or 5 times what you would typically see as the strength of concrete, just for components that were holding this cantilever portion. To address the existing water, we used some dewatering systems through the construction and specified structural systems, as I've already mentioned, that could really live in this environment for decades. Thinking about those, the fact that we were integrating Penetron or Zypex type of additives into the concrete that makes it kind of impregnable to water, for example, and also the use of galvanized rebar in the concrete mix that were all corrosion inhibitors and that would resist, again, the saltwater intrusion on there. But the freshwater lens also points to a bigger story about sea levels and their current rising. So the pressure on the lens will increase, pushing this water even closer to the surface and compounding flooding waters and corrosion risks in the long run. And so we had to design with that future in mind. So instead of treating the water table like a one-time obstacle, we really saw it as something that was ongoing condition. The site was constantly a dynamic system that was in flux, and as well would be a even more of a omnipresent kind of issue in the future. And so we built the resilience into the park that could adapt and endure to that current and future condition.
I was trying to think if I have ever specified 12,000 psi concrete. I'm pretty sure I have not ever. I was like, did he just say 12,000? Did he mean 2,000? Um, Construction always has a good story, or two, or 12, of tackling unexpected challenges or problem solving. There's no such thing as a perfect project. I don't like to call them problems, really. I like to call them challenges because, we go into it doing all the homework, but you get out there and sometimes things don't come together quite the way you anticipated, or you encounter artifacts in the ground, or, just something that you might have had an idea it could happen, but it surprises you. What would you say your biggest challenge? Give me one good story about the construction phase.
Oh, this project has a lot of stories. Yeah, I guess one of the biggest challenges for it was, like we were just talking about, the high water table and the coastal site that we've been talking about this whole time. The minute we began excavation, we hit saturated soils a few feet down. These were huge issues that when we were trying to pour the foundation strong enough for to supporting this 25-foot cantilever, we had to kind of work through. So the solution was the mix of engineering and sequencing. We looked at how we were excavating, but the structural team specifying concrete with admixtures, the galvanized rebar to protect against this kind of long-term saltwater corrosion. We were literally building resilience into the structure from the ground up. And that challenge came to, also with another component of the overlook, the perforated metal skin. The geometry was complex, and in the coastal environment, the finishes had to be flawless. We had to work hand in hand with Eric Small, like I mentioned, his team at EES Design Studio, who treated these custom pieces of sculpture um, that were essentially adjusted and aligned until the skin read as one continuous glowing surface, but also they had to be corrosive and erosion and kind of thinking about all these other issues. And so I can't overstate, too, how critical shift construction was throughout the process. So Justin Schiff and his team, who approach the job as true partners, not adversaries. But the projects like these are basically a 10,000 question test, and you're going to run into surprises or conditions that weren't in the drawings. And so what mattered was how we responded. And whenever an issue came up, Justin's team worked shoulder to shoulder with us to find alternatives. And preserve the design intent. And that level of collaboration was essential. And it's a big reason the project not only overcame its challenges, but ended up even stronger and I think more beautiful while staying on schedule and within the original budget.
Well, that's a lot. I hadn't even thought about saltwater. And I don't know how that one didn't pop in my head, but I mean, the stuff is destructive to
Right.
building materials. And it's always a whole different set of considerations whenever you're doing any project near the coast. And that takes some extra work, a lot of extra work, it sounds like. So having a great team would be critical. What would you say your favorite thing about this project is?
Yeah, my favorite, I mean, for me, it's the transformation. To stand on the site now, walking among the sea grape and the kind of gumbo trees, watching kids play on the dunes, or looking out over the overlook, you'd never guess it used to be a hot, lifeless parking lot. I mean, for me, what was truly telling and the favorite thing about the project was the day it opened and a child running past me and just kind of saying, "Who are," him and his mom are walking by, and we had just had the opening, and his mom's like, he asked, "Who are you?" And his mom's like, "He was the architect." And the fact that the kids goes, "You did this? You designed this? This is cool." And it was like that was a kind of amazing moment that really gives you this kind of clarity that it's, even though all the stress, all the problems, and all the things that you had to do, you would at that moment, that's when it all just kind of sheds away and you realize that, this complete reinvention of a kind of dead place or a dead piece of land into a kind of living, resilient, and joyful public space is incredibly rewarding. And so I also love the fact that the park works on many levels at once. And we've talked about some of those things. It's infrastructure, it's habitat, it's civic space, it's art. But my favorite moment is really when I see people, like I said, using it. Families in the shade, kids climbing all over it, skating down the sloped walkway to the canopy. And something or someone even pausing at the overlook and taking a look at the ocean, that's when the project comes alive, and you see how resilience and design translated directly into a kind of quality of life project, is extremely rewarding.
Before we get to our two closing questions, tell me, what is Brooks and Scarpa up to? What are you working on now that I get to hear about in the future?
What aren't we working on? I mean, yeah.
I know, loaded
Yeah.
question. Maybe pick one or two cool things.
Yeah, at Brooks Scarpa, I mean, we're really excited. It's an exciting moment. We are transitioning into the next decade. It's amazing to note that we're just celebrating the end of our third decade of practice. We're not only thinking about projects, but also about the practice itself, how we build succession, mentor the next generation, and at the same time, double down on the mission that has always guided us: design that advances resilience, equity, and community. The one on the project side, I guess I could say that the work is wide ranging and it's deeply connected. We're leading a major affordable housing project called Vista Breeze in Miami Beach. When it's complete, this will be the largest development, or at least affordable housing development built in the city of Miami Beach in the last 50 years. At the same time, we're also working on a more intimate community-driven project like Milani Park and Highland Beach. This project blends cultural history, including the Yamato colony, as well as the oyster shell mound complex that was there, predating colonial and European settlement. And this is also going to be another flood adaptive and new public access to the beach, a new park that's there just north of Boca Raton. We're also pushing forward on adaptive reuse, turning underutilized buildings into affordable housing projects and community infrastructure here in Fort Lauderdale. And really that's because we still believe that the most sustainable building is the building that already exists. And we're also at University of Florida right now reimagining the College of Design, Construction, and Planning and their new collaboratory. This is set to open in spring 2026. And this fall, on November 2nd, in fact, we're going to be opening the new arts education expansion at the Art Culture Center in Hollywood, Florida. And this is linking nearly a century of history from the 1924 Kagi mansion that we're attached onto to this new expansion. And so this is also timed with the center's 50th anniversary. And so it's really a complex myriad of streetscapes, parks, housing, cultural arts projects, higher education projects. And so there's a lot of work that we're really engaged in right now. So whether we're rethinking, as I was saying, housing or adapting to climate change or creating public spaces that celebrate culture and history, our focus is always going to be consistent. I think it's going to be tackling big challenges that are facing our communities through design that's practical, resilient, and hopefully inspiring.
As my old boss used to say, it keeps you out of the pool hall. When I say it's so busy, it keeps you out of the pool hall, Cherise.
Okay.
Not that I ever hung out at the pool hall, but
That's funny.
so closing two questions. I always close with a broad industry question and my final question everybody gets. I don't get to talk to landscape architects a whole lot. I've only had a couple as guests on the show. Uh, and I'm always curious, like, what are the challenges? Like, I work for engineers now, but I spent most of my career working for architects and spent a little time in construction. So, in your opinion, what are some of the biggest challenges currently being faced by the landscape architecture industry? What kind of keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I think it's really, the biggest challenge is scale, and it's gonna be climate change and other related issues. So landscape architects are being asked to really solve some of the most pressing issues of our time. Again, like I said, climate change, sea level rise, heat, ecological collapse, but often on sites that are tiny in comparison to the scale of the problem. So we're constantly trying to connect to the small to the large and how 1 acre of rewilded land, like the park we were just talking about, can have a ripple effect across an entire city's resilience. Another challenge is that our professions are often undervalued or brought in too late. So yet, as DC Alexander Park showed, the landscape it becomes infrastructure. It's the first time or the first line of defense against storms, heat, flooding, and the earlier landscape architect can get into a project, and the earlier landscape architecture, for that matter, architecture too, is integrated into the planning, the better the outcome is for our communities. And so what keeps me up at night is urgency. We're running out of time to adapt our cities. The science is clear, seas are rising, storms are intensifying, and communities, especially vulnerable ones, are at risk. And so the question is whether we as designers and policymakers can move enough quickly and quickly enough to match the scale and the speed of those challenges.
Well, I know that the profession of landscape architecture just during my career is so drastically different now than it was when I started in this business. I mean, you always thought of the landscape architect as deciding where the trees and the shrubs go. And, we hadn't at that point tackled climate change and all of the things going on now where landscape really has become so much more critical. And you're right. It has historically been an undervalued profession. It's just go pick my trees and you're done. Um, and I'm glad that I'm glad that's what you brought up because I want more people to understand it's not the same game anymore. And be thinking about that maybe sooner rather than later when it's too late to maybe you bring your consultants on too late and maybe can't do the things you could have done if you would have at least had some conversations early.
Right.
So I appreciate that. So final question. Everybody gets this question. Easiest question of the day. That's complete
Which means it's
sarcasm
going to be the hardest, I know.
because this is not the easiest question of the day. So, and I don't know, after this interview, it might be easier for you, but I like to believe that we all hope to live a life that leaves some kind of contribution to make the world a better place? So, personal or professional, what do you hope your impact will be?
Great question. I guess I hope my impact is providing that design can be both practical and transformative. On one hand, our work must solve urgent, tangible problems like we were talking about here: sea level rise, flooding, affordable housing, for that matter. But at the same time, design has the power to lift people up, to create joy, and to connect communities more deeply to one another and to the environment. And so, great design should always build a place, history, and culture while preparing us for the future. And so, I guess for me, the architecture and landscape architecture, as well as urban design, aren't separate disciplines. They're parts of the same system, and that's the perspective I bring to my practice. It's how I teach at places like Florida Atlantic University, where I teach architecture, and really try to push that resilience, equity, and beauty are not competing goals; that they are, inseparable. In that, if future generations of designers and communities embrace that idea, I think I'd feel I've made a meaningful contribution. And that means it's beyond my own work, and has a ripple effect beyond or within, others, within policy making, which for me in our practice at Brooks Scarpa, we find much more profound in making lasting change is affecting others and affecting policy. And, at the human scale, my hope is that spaces we create resonate in people's lives, that children remember climbing and laughing in a park we've designed, as we were just talking about, or that a family finds shade or comfort that was not once there or was once an asphalt parking lot. That's some that someone feels, I guess, pride in their community because of a place we helped shape. In the end, I want our work to demonstrate that design isn't just about buildings or landscapes. It's about creating systems of resilience and memories that leave communities stronger, more connected, and more hopeful.
Well, Jeff, you don't just talk the talk, you walk the walk. And I have the hugest amount of respect for that. Thank you so much for coming in. This interview has been an absolute delight. You can come back anytime and tell me about any project you're working on. Um, I already had a lot of respect for your firm, but it just leveled up. So I really appreciate you taking time out of your insane for months now schedule to come and talk to me about this very beautiful park. And next time I'm in the area, I will go check it out.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate it, and thank you for having me.
Anytime.